So hello everyone and welcome to our 9th Wellbeing Wednesday. Amazing that this is still going. We've got so many women that we want to keep speaking to from all around Australia, and I'm delighted to introduce you today to Paige Williams, Dr. Paige Williams, who is from Geelong. And Paige we'll get her to introduce herself in a moment, but she has got so much wealth of knowledge to share with us today around her expert area of positive psychology and leadership. And she's also done some research recently that involves looking at resilience, looking at how people have been going over the last couple of months, and she's had some really interesting findings about how rural and regional Australians and families have been going compared to the rest. So it'll be really terrific to tap into her research today. So I'll get you to introduce yourself in a sec, Paige. So we've got with Wellbeing Wednesday, if there's any newbies on board today, our framework is that we just spend a couple of minutes connecting and saying hello. We'll then interview Paige and for probably about 30 or 40 minutes. And then we'll hand it over to you because you participants, because we want to hear from you about what you're taking away with you today. So we don't want you to just be sitting back and taking it all in. If you've got a pen, make sure that you're grabbing that pen and a notepad and you're taking down any hints and tips for your well-being or references, because one of the great things about this community is that we've always in the chat box got lots of references and resources being shared as well. So keep busy, keep your attention over the next hour, and we also want you to be asking questions. So we've got our questions, but we do want you to also lead that. So if you're totally new to Zoom, I'm presuming most of you are okay with Zoom, but if you move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a chat box, and if you click on that chat box, a panel will appear on your right. If I can ask you to, down the bottom, there's a little 2 and it says to send chat to, and you need to have ticked that box that says all panelists and attendees. That means that everybody gets to hear your goals. If you just all panelists, only Paige, Louise and I see that, and that the others don't get to see it. There's also a Q&A box. So we want you to ask your questions in the chat box. But if you've got sort of something you want to ask a little bit more privately, then you can use the Q&A box, and that will just go to Louise, Paige and I. We are recording this session today and it will be posted on my website afterwards. I have a lot of women who say to me when they miss the session that they do go and watch the video afterwards. So it's just the video, it's not the chat box that is shared on my website. So you can tap away and type in whatever you need to, and that will be just within our group today. So Louise, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe who have we got today tuning in?
It's Cynthia, Wednesday again, and yes, it's great to be here for week 9, and it's great to see that we've got a few speakers lined up for the next few weeks as well. So as Cynthia mentioned, I've been working with Cynthia over the years, meeting originally, I don't know how long ago now, but Leadership Victoria, running leadership programs, and we got crafty and put a few programs together ourselves, and one of our areas of interest is wellbeing, and then we've narrowed it even further to work with women. Not to say that the men are not welcome on this. We've generally had 1 or 2 men join us, which is great to see. And I just want to have a quick look in our attendees. So I'm seeing lots of familiar names, lots of frequent flyers, and I am seeing, what name did I just see there that was not familiar? No, can't see it at the moment, but yeah, now, Tim Fulton, have we had Tim visit us before? Oh, okay, rightio. So probably not sitting in business or first class, but has been a fly before. So we've got about 30 guests on the aircraft. We're about to zoom off, and You've already given us all the instructions, Cynthia, and over to you.
Great. So I would just like to hand over to Paige to introduce herself to the group. And Paige, would you like to tell us just a little bit about yourself and what brings you here today?
Sure, thanks, Cynth. So, hi everyone. As Cynthia said, my name's Paige Williams. You may pick up from the accent, I'm originally from the UK. I've been in Australia now for, must be nearly 17 years now. I lived on the south side of Geelong, so about 10 minutes from the Surf Coast. Interestingly, we had a mini tornado rip through here last night, so there's a bit of devastation going on outside my window this morning. I hope that's not the same with you. I've lived here ever since I came over from the UK, so either on the Surf Coast, moved out to a little place called Moriac, which is inland, a bit more kind of, a little bit more rural, but not as rural as I know some of where some of you are. And now just on the fringes of Geelong, on the Surf Coast side. I have two children, two daughters, Olivia, who's in year 10, and Isabella, who we call Pixie, who's in year 7. Pixie because she's tricksy. I'm sure stories of Pixie will come out as we start chatting about well-being. Yeah, we have a very settled life. I love the work that I do. The work that I do now is a combination of my teaching and research at the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne. And I've been involved there for about 8 years now, since the centre was first established. And that's where I did my doctoral research. So I was based there as a researcher, and I worked at Geelong Grammar School for over 11 years and was part of the team, the very small team there that introduced positive psychology to the school and really opened the door to positive psychology in Australia. We hosted Professor Martin Seligman, who's kind of the guru of the field, at the school for about 9 months. We had what are now kind of the rock stars of the field. And in its earliest days, these researchers whose names now, if you're involved in the field, you would know, people like Barbara Fredrickson, people like Csikszentmihalyi, whose name I can never spell and is the researcher into flow. They actually came and visited the school because at that stage, it was so early, the field was so early in its development, and here was a whole system at Geelong Grammar that was looking to embed it across all of its kind of facets. And my involvement in that was looking at the organisation. So I'm not a school teacher as much as I've been embedded in education for a long time. I have a business studies background. I've been a senior manager. I've been a leader. I've been kind of managing director at the top of the organisational chart, if you like. And I tend to think in terms of systems. So whether that's a system of one, when I'm coaching and mentoring, whether it's a whole system across a community or anything in between. So my interest at Geelong Grammar was, how do we embed positive psychology into the school as a whole? And that tends to be how I look at things. How is it that we create strategic connections that mean that we can really leverage and create positive change? Which brings me to my passion for leadership, because I believe that leadership is one of the most potent, in fact, I think it is the most potent leverage point that we have in any system. And whether that's a friendship group, whether it's a family, whether it's a team, whether it's a school, an organisation, leadership, and by that I mean little L leadership, first and foremost, how we show up every day is the most potent leverage point we have. And then when we layer onto that formal leadership, authority and power, and if that's used for good rather than evil, then we have even more leverage that we can play with to create positive change. So that's where my work sits, is how do we create positive change by leveraging leadership capacity, and really help people understand how they can realize the latent leadership capacity that each of us has, but perhaps we haven't yet realized ourselves and realized in terms of living it out and putting it into the world.
Yeah, I love that, Paige. I think particularly for a lot of women, there's this, you know, we hear about imposter syndrome all the time. I think I was talking to a coaching client yesterday, and we were talking about the unconscious competence, when you're awesome at something, but you just think, oh, everyone else is good at that, so you don't actually value that yourself. And I think that, yeah, it's interesting that a lot of women, I think, don't recognise that power of how great they actually are.
And that's so true, and how important it is that actually until we step into that leadership capacity, we can't realize it. And that's why I like to use the term capacity rather than power, because I think that some of us have a pretty ambivalent relationship with that word power, and particularly because often it is abused rather than used for good. So I like to use the word capacity because I think it is something then that we can be curious about, that we can hold the possibility of, and in a way that can feel congruent and we can feel comfortable with. And that's as much for men as for women. But I do think that, yeah, for all kinds of social conditioning reasons and personal dynamics and family dynamics, often we don't kind of show up and step into our leadership power. You're absolutely right. And it's something I've only done probably, I'd say, in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, really. It's taken, despite being in all of those roles and doing all of this research, it's taken you quite a while to. What happened? What happened? How did you make that transition?
So I think I've been in lots of I've been in lots of leadership roles throughout my life. I was school captain in primary school. I was school captain in senior school. I was hockey captain. I was this captain. I was that captain. So this idea of kind of having formal leadership responsibility and needing to kind of gather people together and move us forward for whatever purpose that was, is something that I've had experience with and seems to come quite naturally. But I wouldn't necessarily meant that I saw myself as a leader, or that I recognized the power, let's use that word. I recognize the power, the capacity that I have, whether I have those formal leadership titles or not. And I think for me, that's where really potent leadership capacity sits, is actually separate from those formal leadership roles. Because I don't have, what am I now? I am CEO of my own thought leadership practice, right? And I have to get up and manage myself every day. And yes, of course, I have other people that I employ and that I contract in for various services for my business. But I don't have a team. I'm not at the top of an organizational tree anymore. And yet I feel I have more leadership capacity. I feel I'm making more impact in the world than I ever have. And that's the kind of unrealized leadership that I think we have the opportunity to lean into. And that's what excites me, is opening up that for people and understanding how that is such a driver for well-being, for your well-being as well. That really, we talk about authentic leadership. We talk about service-based leadership. We've got all these frameworks, these leadership frameworks, but really this understanding of when you show up really in who you are and how you want to show up in the world and make the difference that only you can make in the world. Wow, that's when all the lights start to go on, and in all kinds of different ways it starts to drive well-being and performance and connection, and it just creates this amazing ripple in the world.
So take because you said that it's only been in the last couple of years that you reckon you've stepped into that power. What made the lights go on for you, Paige? Was there an event, or was it a transition? What do you think? So that's question part one. What was it?
Okay.
That where you really did go, I'm awesome. And then part two, what impact did that have on your well-being and your sense of self?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I think it's without a doubt, it's been a journey. And I think that what I've had to do is almost let go of the me that was always the leadership position Paige. So the school captain, the this captain, the youngest general manager here, the most senior, blah blah blah. I had to let go of that, because in tying my identity to those positions, I was disempowering who I am and becoming the position. And so it was almost as I stepped away from my role at Geelong Grammar. I'd been there for 11 years. I'd applied. So we'd evolved the positive education department as it was then, created a strategic plan that I'd been heavily driving because of my business background. It evolved to become the Institute of Positive Education, which is what it is now, and it has been very successful in taking positive education internationally. And at that point, having been involved for however long that was, myself and my colleague applied for the director's role. Now, you know, if I talk about first lady syndrome, I had been the first lady of the positive education setup the whole way through, and they did not, I mean, it blew them away that I was applying for this director's role. Everyone, you could almost see the jaws drop to the floor that had even happened. And in the end, the school chose to give it to my male counterpart. And so at that point, I decided to graciously take my leave and complete my PhD research, kind of working at the University of Melbourne as a casual lecturer. And it was almost stepping away from the formal leadership roles and just having some time and space to reflect on what my experience had been, what was the difference I wanted to make in the world now that my PhD journey was coming to a close, and what had I learned through that, not just through the research, the PhD journey is definitely a personal development journey as well, because you learn a lot about yourself and you have to take on board feedback at every single stage and understand it's not you, it's about making your piece of research or this particular piece of writing better. So it's quite it kind of breaks you and puts you back together. You become better from it, without a doubt. So I think it was actually coming away from the formal roles and really having the chance to think about, well, does that mean that I am, because I'm not in a formal role in an organization now, who am I? It really brought me back to, so who am I, and how do I want to show up, and what difference do I want to make? Not because it's in a position description, because now I have a choice about that. So how am I writing my own position description for who and how I want to be in the world and the difference I want to make?
Love it, Paige. How am I writing my own position description? Write that down, everyone. That is gold, absolute gold. So yeah, there is really something, it sounds like, too, it's your own identity, your identity of, like, so letting go of past identity, and then for here, now, and future, what is that identity that you want to take on for yourself now? And tell me,
alongside that, Cynth, to be transparent, there was stuff going on in my personal life. My marriage was ending, so I was coming out of formal roles in that sense as well. So within this kind of, I don't know, I think it was maybe an 18-month period, I moved out of Geelong Grammar School, which is quite institutionalised. I was working on a casual basis with the University of Melbourne. I was finishing off my PhD research. I was, coming away from a 15-year marriage. So there was this opportunity of really opening up and going, okay, where do you want to go with this now, Paige? It's not a blank page. I mean, it's not, it's not that you're rewriting everything, but there is a chance here for you to actually be more intentional and make choices around what happens next. And when you say, what impact did that have on my well-being, it felt like I'd shaken off chains. It felt like now I could really start stop being the Paige that other people expected me to be, or that I thought they expected me to be. And I think that's been one of my really big learnings, is that, and I think it's the work of Byron Katie, who talks about suffering sits between our expectations and our reality. And, I've done a lot of kind of self-development work since in the last 4 years or so, since I've kind of broken away from the what does everyone else want Paige to be, to kind of discover who I want to be and how I want to show up. And I've loved Byron Katie's work, and it's really held me to account around what is the reality of what's here and now for me, and what are the expectations either I'm placing on myself or that others are placing on me that I don't want to hold on to. They're not serving me well. And then what's the reality? If I've got an expectation around something, and I'm an eternal optimist and I tend to expect things to go for the best, and then when they don't, I'm shattered. And yet actually, if I'd been really realistic in the first place, there wouldn't be that shattering, there wouldn't be that suffering. And so that's something I hold on to personally, in terms of, okay, what's the reality? What are my expectations? And how can I make sure that there's overlap around, there's not a gap there that means that I'm going to be suffering at some point. And it's often what I use with my coaching clients as well.
That's so interesting. The term suffering, I think a lot of us do. We do suffer, don't we, in life, and which impacts on our well-being hugely. And there's something there, Paige, about what you were saying. What was it? Oh, that's right. Expectation versus reality. Tell me, because a lot of women have trouble with enforcing boundaries, their own boundaries, and articulating their own expectations. What happens for you around your expectations and the reality, and communicating with others around that?
Okay, so I think that there's two different dynamics going on here. One, for me anyway, this is my experience of it. One is what are the expectations that I have of myself? Okay, and I can be pretty hard on myself, as most of us are. You know, that internal dialogue where actually you're much meaner to yourself than you are to anyone in the outside world. And if anyone spoke to you the way that you do, you would never speak to them again. And yet we put up with it 24/7. So I've become very aware of what are the expectations I'm placing on myself. And look, you know, simple things like, you know, I tend to speak to myself in very black and white absolute terms, right? So the internal dialogue will be, you're never allowed to eat chocolate. You must do X amount of exercise every day. If you don't do this, then you're a bad fill in the gap. And so these very kind of black and white absolute terms. And I've learned to soften that internal dialogue. And I think it's Brené Brown that talks about, you know, speak to yourself as if you're a wise, kind friend. Or it might be Kirsten Neff in her self-compassion work. She talks about, you know, rather than just being so self-critical, which actually, when we come to the neuroscience of it, closes our brain down, because we go into this fight or flight response because, funnily enough, we don't feel safe. Now, how crazy is it that we're not feeling safe with ourselves? You know, if we were feeling unsafe with someone in a close personal relationship, we probably would do something about it, or would be if we had a friend who was in a close personal relationship in which they didn't feel safe, we would implore them to get some help. And yet often we don't feel safe in our own closest, most personal relationship, which is with ourselves. So how is it I've really tried to start speaking to myself and kind of I imagine myself as my best friend. Imagine myself as someone like you, Synth. If Synth rang me up and was talking to me the way I'm talking to myself, what would I say to Synth? And I've managed to kind of change the tone of how I do that. And that's how I've softened the expectations I have of myself. Now, when it's other people's expectations, here I really tune into my physicality. All right. And we often, and I'm definitely guilty of this, live too much in our heads. And you know me pretty well, Synth. I think a lot. I should have, chronic overthinker just on every single top that I wear, because I overthink everything. And so what I've had to learn to do is to dial out of my head a bit and into my physical space, into my physical body, because before the fight or flight response really takes hold in our brains, there are physical cues, and we need to really understand what those are. And for me, I get a knot in my tummy, right? That's my first cue. And if I feel myself responding like that when someone is asking something of me, then I know that I'm getting something in me. It's a trigger. Something is being triggered. And it might be often when we have that kind of this kind of response, and we want to kind of puff our chests out and go, whoa, that's not okay. For me, it starts with this knot in the stomach. And that's because in some way I'm feeling what we call trespass. There is a line being crossed. So I've learned that that's my trigger. And if that is happening, then there's something about this expectation that's being asked of me that's not okay with me. And at that point, I've trained myself to really slow the whole conversation down. And Synth, you were talking beautifully about curiosity before we kind of went into our main session here, and go, okay, let's find out what's happening here, not just for me, but for this other person who I'm seeing has got these expectations that I'm uncomfortable with. And so I go into question mode and kind of unpack what's going on here. Why are there these expectations? What is it that's triggering this for me? So, understanding more so that I can either set the boundaries that are appropriate, but I'm not jumping to conclusions, and I'm not dealing with reality, because I'm being curious to find out more. Does that make sense?
And from a neuroscience point of view, that curiosity takes us into a different part of our brain, doesn't it?
That's right.
It enables us to connect better.
So what it does is it helps us not go into the fight and flight response, which triggers our amygdala, which is the most oldest part of our brain, doesn't have capacity for language, only has capacity for feelings. By asking questions, we're having to keep our more rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, in play, because we're having to stay engaged, we're having to listen in order to be able to ask questions and listen to the response. And that helps us be more effective. And it also helps us make good decisions around, okay, so what are the boundaries that I want to set here?
Yep, terrific. Now, there are so many things that I just want to talk to you about. We could talk forever, Paige, as with all of our guests. It's just like, once you start talking, there's just so much ground you could cover. But I do want to kind of make a little switch, because I'm aware that you've recently, so first of all, actually, what's positive psychology?
Okay.
Like, just number one. Number two, what research did you do recently that you would like to share with the group today?
Of course. So, okay, so let's do positive psychology 101. Yep. So positive psychology is the empirical research into what makes life worth living. So the backstory to this is that psychology grew out of a need, out of World War I and World War II, to deal effectively with people who were coming back from war zones and were basically suffering what we now call post-traumatic stress. And so psychology, from that basis, had a really good understanding of what it means to be psychologically ill, because we had lots and lots of examples of it from the world wars. Now, in about the end of the 1990s, Professor Martin Seligman, who I mentioned right at the top of our discussion, was the president of the American Psychological Association. And he had this epiphany in his personal life that was associated with his daughter. And there's a whole story behind that, which I won't go into. But basically, it made him realize that actually, in the same way that the brain has a negativity bias, and we tend to notice only the things that are of a potential threat or that are negative in our environment, that's exactly what psychology had been doing for the past 50 years. Only been studying what it is that brings pain and suffering and how many ways we can be psychologically ill. And it had done that really effectively. We have something called the DSM, which is a statistical manual that tells us in how many ways we can be psychologically ill. And let me tell you, edition 7 is about this thick, right? It's about 4 inches thick. Amazing. Never read it, because you won't ever feel the same again. You'll definitely come out more ill than you went in when you first opened page 1. Do not read it. So what Seligman realized was that actually, hang on a minute, that's only half the picture. There's a whole other side of human experience that has never been studied with the same rigor, with the same scientific method, that looks at what makes life worth living, what brings us joy, what makes us feel connected, what gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. And so he put what he called a call to arms out in his president's speech in the year 2000 to say, hey, we've done all of this. Now let's apply that same rigor to what makes life worth living, to the positive side of the human experience. And so that's what the field of positive psychology is all about, is it's empirical research into how do we live our best lives? What does it mean to live a good life? And what are the pathways that take us towards feeling psychologically well, having good relationships, feeling a sense of meaning and purpose, feeling physically well, that comes into it as well. And so that's what the broad field of positive psychology looks at. And now extending on from that, we have the field of what we call the positive sciences. So whilst it started as positive psychology, we now have positive business, positive education, we have positive neuroscience, etc., 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 which is taking the same premise of not what makes us ill, but what helps us thrive in these different aspects of the human experience. That was question 1.
That was question 1, and thank you. That was really fascinating. I had a number of comments in the chat box about that this is so interesting. And Belle's studying her diploma of positive psychology. Good on you, Belle. And secondly, Paige, your research.
Yes, right. Okay. So another part of my world is that I'm a board member for a charity called Uplifting Australia. Now, Uplifting Australia, a small not-for-profit based in Sydney with amazing, amazing hopes and dreams. So Uplifting Australia is about creating emotionally well systems within families. And it has what we've now just launched, a Family Connect program, which is about developing 4 skills in families in order to create an emotionally well system. And one of the things that we promote in Uplifting Australia is that, you know, skills around emotional well-being are just as important as reading and writing. And when you think about, you know, what's taken you towards your best experiences in life, or what's taken you towards doing well, being successful, however you might define that in life, understanding your own emotional self and how to connect with others, there's no doubt that's a core skill. And yet it's something that we don't teach children, we don't teach adults how to do very well. So recently with Uplifting Australia, we went out into the market and we did a piece of research with around 1,000 Australian families just to have a look at, so how has COVID-19 impacted family functioning? Because we're hearing a lot about how the juggle of homeschooling and being at work and everyone being at home, and how did my house shrink by 40% just because there's more people in it? You know, and the real kind of the struggle that's coming with the COVID-19 experience. And look, what our research found is that there's no doubt that some people are definitely struggling, and you know, there's no surprise there, particularly families where an adult has lost a job or where they are single parent families. Those families are saying that they are struggling the most. But some other interesting results, and I'm just going to make sure I'm going to get my notes in front of me so I've got all of my stats correct. So around a third are saying, a third of the families' research was saying that actually what it's highlighted for them is that yes, they do need to invest in the well-being and emotional well-being of their families. So when we think about the idea of thriving, so optimal well-being, we sometimes think that that is kind of, you might get a picture of laying in a hammock on an island sipping a cocktail, you know, and that's ultimate well-being. And yet this research and research I've done in Australian workplaces and in the last few weeks US workplaces actually suggests that thriving often involves struggle. And that's what seems to be coming out of this picture with families in the COVID experience, is that yes, they're saying, oh my God, at times I just want to pull my hair out because I've got, you know, grade 3 maths going on over here, I've got grade 8 science going on over there, I've got a teleconference going on in the back room, and I'm still trying to cook dinner and someone else wants something else from me. So there's no doubt that there's struggle involved, but they're also, and this is around a third, are saying, we're seeing benefit from this. We're more involved in our children's schooling. We feel more connected. We're spending more quality time together, and we have a greater understanding of what each of us does. We don't just leave the house each day for 6 or 8 hours and have no understanding of each other's worlds. So another couple of things that were interesting to come out of it. So firstly, thriving and struggle often go hand in hand. And that is
really good to remember, isn't it? When you're struggling, to keep that in mind.
It is, and it also can, and what was interesting was it also connects into the book I've just finished writing around becoming anti-fragile, which is this idea that actually we need a certain amount of struggle in order to thrive and grow. And when we become too comfortable and too stagnant, that's not good for us. Now, that's not to say that, you know, high levels of stress over a long period of time is a good thing. That is not what I'm saying at all, but we do need to be challenged. And it is sometimes as we come out the other side of the struggle that we look back and we go, wow, actually, do you know what? I've grown through that. I've actually got better through that. And when we were talking about my personal journey, there's no doubt that that 2 year period for me was transformational, because there was a great deal of struggle involved in that. And it really took me to lift myself and to really do some work in order to come through it. And I continue to do that now. So two other things I want to say. One is struggle and thriving go hand in hand. The second thing is that there are a couple of groups in this family research that appear to be dealing with the complexities and the challenges of COVID more easily than others. And they inherently show this level of anti-fragility, this ability to actually thrive through struggle, through the experience of it. The first was that frontline workers, families of frontline workers, whether it was nurses or police officers, those families did not feel as impacted by the COVID-19 experience. Now, what we think may sit behind that is that they're kind of more used to, different shift patterns or have being exposed to kind of these extreme circumstances. Now, the second group that did not seem as impacted were rural families. So we think that this may be because, firstly, metropolitan families are very much in that pattern of, get up, commute maybe to school and to work and So there's a routine and a pattern to metropolitan life that was very much more impacted by everyone staying at home, no one commuting, people not going to school. There was more impact in a metropolitan type routine than there was potentially in a rural one, where perhaps there isn't such that commute and that kind of pace to life that we might see in metro areas. The second reason we think that there was that kind of inbuilt resilience, that inbuilt capacity to kind of learn to thrive through the struggle is because we've just come out of, or have we come out of yet, our period of drought. And now we've just come out of that period of bushfires, intense struggle over the summer period, where rural families have really had to already dig deep. So perhaps there was already this capacity for resilience and anti-fragility present that there wasn't in metro families because it hadn't been called upon.
Fascinating. I'm just wondering, if anyone wants to type in the chat box any reactions to that, it'd be really good to hear from what your perspective is on that. But yeah, I definitely with rural families also, there's a lot more often that's out of your control when you're in a rural community, because of those weather, particularly the weather patterns, and the way that has a far-reaching, if one sector's not going okay, that has a ripple effect to the rest of the community. And so with all these extreme weather events, people are used to dealing with something that's really big that they have absolutely no control over.
Yeah, and what we come back to then, Cynth, is expectations versus reality, right? The expectations in a rural community are different. They don't expect to be able to control everything because they're dealing with Mother Nature at so much more closely. So they let go of the expectation that they control all facets of their lives. Whereas metro families perhaps have expectations that they are much more in control of their lives because they haven't got that kind of natural environment interface in the same way that rural families have. There's something else I want to share with you out of the research. Now, this actually came out of the workplace research that I did, and it's been shown in Australian workplaces, 1,000 Australian workers in March this year and in November last year. So we went back to Australian workplaces just as essential businesses closed down for COVID. And then in the last couple of weeks, we've been into the US and done equivalent research with US workers. Now, I think we would all agree around this COVID-19 situation, wow, how grateful are we all to be living in Australia? I have relatives and friends still in the UK. I know they're doing it super tough. I have friends in the US and they're having a very different experience of COVID. So the thing I want to share with you, and it's a tiny slice of this research, but I found it fascinating, was that when we looked at thriving and struggle, and I've just said to you, thriving and struggle sometimes go hand in hand. In fact, often they do. And what we found was that the people who rated themselves as being consistently thriving, these are Australian workers at the end of last year. When we went back into the workplaces in March this year, that number, which was around 14%, had reduced to around 10%. But what was interesting, that wasn't surprising, right? Because we were starting to see COVID was starting to get its grip. What was particularly interesting, though, was when we look at how that group, that 10% who still in March this year were saying they were consistently thriving, right? That group it had reduced in size, but of greater impact was that group's performance, satisfaction and engagement in their work had reduced significantly compared to people who were experiencing some struggle but still getting through. So what that tells me, and what that again reinforced for the writing I've been doing around being anti-fragile, is that just because you're thriving doesn't mean that you're anti-fragile. You can be thriving, but because nothing has been kind of being asked of you in your environment. So unless you're being tested in some way, maybe that thriving isn't actually as robust as you might think it is. And as soon as you're tested, your levels of thriving drop straight away. Does that make sense?
Mm.
There appears to be perhaps this fragility around thriving when it actually isn't developed through a pathway of some kind of challenge and struggle. Because if it's there just because everything is easy and comfortable, then maybe you don't have the resources that you need to deal when your environment becomes uncertain and is changing and is complex. Maybe that's when your thriving falls off a cliff. And that's what I've been fascinated to research and write about, is how is it we can make sure we're not there when we're thriving. It's because we are robust and we're learning and we're intentionally moving forward in a way that helps us be better and be able to cope with things better as we learn and grow.
So Paige, in that case, what would in terms of your lesson about that for people on the call who might at times struggle, what comfort do they take from that, or what can they take from those experiences?
Okay, so
around their well-being, I guess, impact on
around
well-being.
So I think I think one thing is again, I do come back to expectations and reality, and I think we need to let go of expectations that thriving doesn't involve some struggle sometimes. Okay, so thriving and struggle can go hand in hand. That doesn't mean they should have a permanent attachment. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have to struggle in order to thrive, but it is accepting that sometimes striving through struggle is what takes you towards thriving. And actually it's when you need to dig deep and find your best self and really put the effort in, that's when you come out feeling most proud of what you've achieved. So it's not that they're permanently attached, but it is that they can go hand in hand. So let's one thing, shift our expectations. I think the other thing I would recommend is that idea around so I want to use some questions, because I find questions are the most portable way for us to really get to the heart of an issue. So as you're coming through something, and if you're struggling with something, there are questions that Carol Dweck, who has done lots of research into growth mindset, and a growth mindset is focused around how do I learn and grow and develop, and understanding that we have a capacity to do that throughout our lifespan, no matter how old we are. And it's called a mindset because physiologically our brains are always able to grow new neural pathways. Okay, so it's not that physiologically we can't do it, but it's a mindset that actually stops us even opening ourselves up to the opportunity to learn if we don't believe we can. So,
isn't it so great, Paige, to know that nothing is fixed and that we can totally do, really, we can do most anything we want. And it's just a retraining our brain. I just find that so exciting and gives me lots of optimism for the future and my ability and other people's ability.
Now that's not to say that, if you decide at the age of 64 you want to become a neurosurgeon, that's going to be possible. That there are limits to it, and it won't necessarily mean that you'll reach a mastery level of whatever skill or ability it is that you're wanting to develop. But understand that physiologically your brain can grow and it can learn, so you can learn. So what I find helpful is as I'm grappling with something, to ask myself these 3 questions, which are based in Carol Dweck's work. The first is, what went well? So this is about us understanding that we're not starting with a zero base. In any situation, in any person, there are resources, there are strengths, there are capacities that we can use. So as you come out of, whether it's a conversation or a meeting, have a think about, okay, what went well in there, what was okay, what landed okay, and then ask the question, where did I struggle? Okay, and what this does is it speaks to our brain's need to actually control the environment and to move away from risk and threat, and to think about, okay, where did I struggle? What didn't go well? It helps our brains give space to that without letting it take over completely. And then the third question is the critical question: what do I learn? So what went well? Where did I struggle? What do I learn? Because by understanding what your resources are, what you need to improve and develop, that brings you to your learning point, and that takes you forward. So I find those 3 questions can be really helpful.
The power of questions, Paige.
Love a good question.
And curiosity. Now, just conscious of time, so we always ask our guests to share 3 tips. Were they your 3 tips, or do you have 3 other tips for wellbeing that you share with our audience?
So my 3 tips, I think my 3 tips would be, one is check your internal dialogue, be kind to yourself. The second one is check your expectations versus reality. And there are some great questions around, you know, what you've talked about, Cynth, in some of your LinkedIn articles about spheres of influence. What can I control? What can't I control? You know, make sure you're understanding expectations versus reality. And then the third one is, how can I learn forward from what's happening right now? So what is it, you know, asking these questions: what went well? Where did I struggle? What did I learn? Helps you learn forward into the next situation or the next conversation or the next meeting. And so I think they would be my 3 tips.
Oh, terrific. And everyone, just to let you know, in very exciting news, Paige, as she has mentioned, has written a book, Anti-Fragile, and she has agreed to come back and for another Wellbeing Wednesday. When, Paige, do you think that might be?
I think it will be mid-June, so maybe in about 4 or 6 weeks' time, mid to late June. Yeah. Great.
And she is going to give us a little special book launch and share with us some of the research and some of the content of her book. So we just thought, well, we've got superstar Paige author, we would make the most of her, and we thought a lot of you would be interested in hearing a lot more about the great book that she has just written. Louise, over to you. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, I'll just go back to, in our Q&A, there was a great, all questions great, but one that Jenny O'Sullivan asked earlier, Paige, with the work at Geelong Grammar, what was the impact on the students after the 11 years of work that occurred?
So the work is ongoing there, firstly to say that. And the second thing is to say that we had started research into a longitudinal, so a long-term piece of research that started with Year 9 students, and is, as I understand it, is continuing beyond their time at school as they start to transition out into university and life beyond. Now, the most recent results I saw of that was that they did a comparison of those students as they entered Year 12. Now, they would be beyond that now, but I haven't been at the school now for 4 years, so I'm not as up to speed with what maybe the latest results this year have been. But the latest results that I'm aware of was that they compared those Year 9 students in their Year 12 with other Year 12 students, and they found that they did have higher levels of resilience, higher levels of well-being, and felt more confident and more motivated to actually intentionally manage their own well-being themselves. And this is what's interesting. In the time since I've left grammar, that we're finding that actually it's not necessarily just the knowledge. It's not enough to teach. the knowledge, you actually have to also address this idea of confidence and motivation. So yes, I know what the skills are, but do I feel confident in my ability to use them? And do I feel motivated to kind of take this tool off of my wellbeing toolkit, tool belt, and actually do something with it? Because otherwise it's just sitting there. So one, do I know how to use the tool? And one, am I motivated to actually take it off of my tool belt and use it? So this idea of confidence and motivation is really now what's the what would you call it? It's the activating ingredient. It's like the yeast in the bread, because without it, nothing happens. So we're focusing, certainly in all the teaching I do now, and it's not in, sometimes it's in schools, but it's obviously, it's with teachers and with adults. I focus on not just knowledge, but actually confidence and motivation to use the knowledge, because that's how they become active in people's lives.
That's great. And Jenny also asked, and you've already mentioned a few books, is there any other recommended reading, and also, let's say, podcasts that you would refer us to, Paige?
So a podcast I'm involved with is called Making Positive Psychology Work. And that's a fabulous one. And it's been started by a lady called Michelle McQuaid. And it's now, I think it's into its, I've just recorded number 187. So there's a lot of podcasts there, and so Martin Seligman is there, Barbara Fredrickson is there, Carol Dweck is there. So all of the kind of top positive psychology researchers and gurus, but also practitioners. So also people who they might be working in HR, they might be leaders, they might be professionals, consultants like we are, who use it in their work every day. And so we interview those type of people as well, and ask about how are they using positive psychology in their practice or in their work as a leader or in HR.
Just to let people know too, we do send an email out. So once you've signed up for an episode of Wellbeing Wednesday, you're on our mailing list, and we'll send you out every week an email that has who's next and what are the lessons from today's Wellbeing Wednesday. We'll include some resources, so the names that have been mentioned and the links to some of the to those resources, and if Paige has any more that we can add into that.
We also got a question from Fiona Lates, a previous guest of ours, a drone guru of the North and I suppose Australia. And Fiona asked, it's a great point about, Paige, what, say, generational differences have you seen? Those where, let's say, students have gone straight into paid careers with limited headaches, opposed to those that have struggled to get a job, and maybe those that, possibly even went through the depression.
Sorry, in relation to?
I think it would go back to when you were polling the 1,000 people, and even Fiona, if you want to add to that, it was a good 10 minutes ago that she asked the question. So I think when you're asking, say, polling 1,000 people, of that 1,000, could you see the generations?
Hang on, I'll just unmute Fiona so she can.
Good idea.
Yeah, Fiona, are you there?
She's just commented.
Unmute. Fiona, you're unmuted. Fiona, you've unmuted.
Yeah, and she's just mentioned that, how well have people coped with our current drama? She doesn't have a mic, so she can't.
Sorry, Fiona.
Just to give you some context, because for Uplifting Australia, our target audience are families with children under the age of 12. So there wasn't a huge generational spread in our sample of data, just because that's the target audience for the Family Connect program. And we did this research to help as part of the launch for the Digital Family Connect program, because we really wanted to get this into families across Australia. And because everyone's in lockdown and so much more digitally attuned at this time, we felt that this was a great way to say, hey, look, everyone's digitally attuned and they're also thinking about the emotional well-being of their families because they're spending so much time together. And we've got a great tool that can help you build 4 skills that will help you really invest in this moving forward. So we didn't get kind of intergenerational data from that survey. And in the workplace one, we did have some generational, we obviously had a range of ages, but I can't remember if there was significant differences across age range. It wasn't something we pulled out as being, oh, look at this is interesting. So I'm not thinking that there was anything particularly significant there.
Thanks, Paige. And a question from Lisa, can we pre-order your book?
Yeah, so when I come back next time, we're just literally in the final stages of layout. And so when I come back next time, yes, we'll make sure that there's a link for you to be able to pre-order it. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Paige. And Cynthia, should we just check in? And I think people have already started mentioning people's own takeaway from today. It would be great for you to share what you have taken from Paige's conversation.
And just while people are thinking about that, I said this at the beginning, but just to remind you that next week we have Sally Murfitt joining us as our special guest. Sally is a consultant in Tasmania, and she works a lot with rural people and businesses, and she's really interested in how teams perform. She's very interested in the people management side of farming businesses. So she's got a lot of terrific insights into well-being, into how people get the best out of themselves. And so we'll really look forward to Sally joining us next week. Louise.
Yes, so Lisa is going to share with her girlfriends to be their self-talk best friends with themselves, and I like that idea. Sally, check her internal dialogue. What are you telling yourself? At Belle, I'll move that along. What else?
Belle just said she's a client of Sally, Sally Murfitt, and she highly recommends her. So everyone has to
speaking next week.
And bring your friends.
Right. Yeah. What else? And Louise, who was our guest last week, is going to Google some more resources, and thanks to everyone for the links. Going to minimise overthinking. I'm assuming that a lot of people might take on board the minimise the overthinking. Nosh, treat myself. Ooh, they're all coming in now very quickly. Treat myself as I would as a 5-year-old. I think I read that a little bit earlier, which is great. Be intentional, make choices. Yeah, referring to resources and going to follow them up and apply these these questions into a reflective practice. Have some focused thinking. That's from Debbie. So
I think Charlie also wrote, ask what went well first rather than jumping straight to where I struggled and what I should have done differently.
Mm-hmm. And Lucy's going to write her own PD, which was a great point from earlier. And Stephanie, keep being brave on her leadership journey.
Good one, Steph.
Can I just say something? I think that was one thing that was really powerful, was once I stepped away from being in a position and being in a role. And for me, those things happened fairly closely together in that, exiting Geelong Grammar and my marriage and the separation from my marriage. It was a case of, okay, so I'm not that role at Geelong Grammar and I'm still a mother, but I'm not a wife anymore. So who am I? But we don't, you don't have to go through those two experiences to ask that question. And you don't have to let go of things to ask that question. So asking that question and then bringing that into the roles that you already have is more powerful. It just, for me, I had got so caught up in the roles, I'd lost touch with who I was. And so for me, that space was only created when I stepped away from some of those roles and kind of looked around and went, oh, I'm not sure I know who I am now because I haven't got a position description and I'm not wearing as many name badges or hats. So what I would say is, yes, the position description is about who are you, and you know, I'm 48 now, and I was like in my mid 40s then, and I'd lost sight of who I was because I'd been living into other people's expectations for so long. But what I would encourage all of you to do is to ask those questions anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I liken it to a spring clean your identity. So just as you would spring clean your wardrobe and go through it and chuck out the clothes that don't fit anymore and buy some new ones, and what you would like to look like now and in the future, that you do that with your own identity and beliefs, and create that wardrobe and identity for who you are now and going forward, rather than having all those old clothes that don't fit or from the 1980s in your closet. Paige, just one more thing I would love to ask you. What's going on with those cards in the background? Because they're beautiful photos. What are they? Tell me more.
So this is my positive psychology intervention wall. So each one of these cards is a positive psychology. It's one way for us to increase our well-being. So for example, here we are dancing. And then on the back here is a little note about what some of the research is that shows that this improves well-being and how you might put this into action. So this one fell off the wall for me a few weeks ago. And so I'm determined to go. I figured it was a sign from somewhere outside of my world. I'm going to take dance lessons once the COVID situation allows us to. So that's my wall of well-being, if you like.
Terrific. And Nosh has just asked, and I want to ask too, where do you get those cards, Paige? Can we get them?
Yes, I'll send you a link to where you can get them from.
Terrific.
From an organisation called Positran. And so, yeah, I'll send you a link since, and you can put it in.
Terrific. Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, so Louise, that's us done for today. I'll stop the recording now and just invite everyone to tune in next week at 1 o'clock on Wellbeing Wednesday. But I'll stop the recording, but we'll keep chatting. Oh, yes, actually, thank you, Louise. So the Victorian Rural Women's Network has initiated this year at the 2020 Virtual Country Cuppa. And so what you can do, if you like, is you can register at the Victorian Rural Women's Network to host your very own country cuppa, and it's getting people together virtually on Zoom to just connect and have a little chat. So we thought next week we will do our Wellbeing Wednesday country cuppa. So for those of you next week, with Sally on, we thought we'll have our usual webinar from 1 till 2, and then from 2 till 3, or however long you can hang around for, we'll do a virtual country cuppa, which is whoever's on wants to grab a cup of tea, that we'll just have a bit of a chat and also take some photos and share them on social media, because that's what the Rural Women's Network wants you to do. So that'll be a great initiative. So thanks, Louise, for reminding me about that. Thank you, Paige. You are golden.
Oh, you're lovely.
Thank you for being so generous, and we are so looking forward to having you back in about 4 weeks or so. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Paige, are you able to stick around for 15 minutes or so? So for those of you who want to stick around and just have a bit more of a chat, stay with us. But for everyone else, we'll see you next